All right, so hi everyone. Thanks a lot for having me and thanks for coming. So I will introduce myself. I'm Clémence Tricaud. I'm assistant professor at the UCLA School of Management. I'm in the GEM group, so the econ group at Anderson. It's my fourth year. I do mostly political economy, so I study voting behaviors, electoral rules, but also, as you will see in this paper, public policies and the impact of politicians' characteristics in the policies they implement. So I'm from inside UCLA, so there is no like scheduled meetings, but of course, feel free to shoot me an email. We can meet anytime we're on campus. So today I will present you a joint project with Juan Pablo Chauvin, which is called Gender and Electoral Incentives, Evidence from Crisis Response. So the starting point of this paper is that we do have ample evidence showing that men and women make different choices. So for instance, the choice of educational major, it has been shown that women tend to under-enroll in STEM, for instance, as well as choices on the labor market in terms of labor supply, for instance. And crucially, those different choices account for a large part of the remaining gender gaps and inequalities we still observe. One common interpretation is that men and women have different personality traits and preferences that push them to make different choices. Now, one alternative explanation is that the presence of gender discrimination and Emily, I have no idea what is this, but I will ignore it. So one alternative explanation is that the presence of gender discrimination and gender stereotypes will create incentives for women to behave differently. So namely, if women expect to be judged more harshly and to face more backlash for a given action, then it is rationally less beneficial for them to do it. So just to illustrate, if we take one example, it has been shown that women in the workplace are less likely to negotiate their salary. But now, if they expect more backlash from entering negotiations, it's rationally less beneficial for them to enter into negotiation. So identifying which of those two stories best accounts for why men and women make different choices is key if you want to better understand the persistence of gender inequalities. And it's also key for the design of policies seeking to reduce them. So if you think everything is driven by pure preferences, then at the extreme, you might conclude that there is no need for policy. They just make different choices because they have different preferences. Now, if you think that it's at least partly driven by the presence of gender norms, gender stereotypes, and biases, then there is room for policies to address those biases and to create more equal societies. Now, we're going to address this question by focusing on the behavior of political leaders. So we look at politics. It's a context where we do have evidence that female politicians tend to make different choices to implement different policies compared to male politicians. And it's also a context where we have evidence of the presence of voters' gender biases. And so the research question we're going to ask in this paper is whether electoral incentives and voter gender bias help explain gender differences in leaders' behaviors. In other words, we want to know whether female politicians are doing things differently only due to their own preferences, or whether they are doing things differently in response to the way voters perceive them. So to do so, we will study the response of politicians to the COVID-19 crisis. So this is an exogenous shock that affected all politicians and that gave rise to very high-stake policies that were extremely salient to voters. So the papers will proceed in three steps. First, I will show you a very simple political agency model just to illustrate how the presence of voters' gender bias can push female and male politicians to undertake different policies. Then in the second part, we'll turn to the empirical test, and we will test the main predictions of the model by looking at gender differences in crisis response over time. And to do so, we look at the behavior of Brazilian mayors. So the nice thing about Brazil is that during COVID, policies were highly decentralized. First, because the central government, Bolsonaro, did not do much in terms of containment policies, and because mayors in general in Brazil have a lot of power. And so they could independently decide over containment policies. And we have 5,000 of Brazilian municipalities. So we can compare municipalities where a female candidate was closely elected to municipalities where a male candidate was closely elected. And so by using this regression discontinuity design, we can compare municipalities that are similar in every aspect, except for the gender of their mayor. I will show you balanced stats at the municipal level. I will also explore other characteristics of the winner and hopefully convince you that we're really capturing the effect of gender and not of other characteristics of the winner that could be correlated with gender. Now, in terms of outcome, we'll look at the daily evolution of COVID-19 death in female versus male-led municipalities. And we will also look at which containment policies were implemented in those municipalities. And then in the third step of the paper, we'll run additional heterogeneity analysis to further test the predictions of the model. First, we'll run heterogeneity analysis by exploiting variation in electoral incentives across mayors. Another nice thing about Brazil is that mayors are term limited, that cannot run more than 2 times. So we have variation in electoral incentives across mayors. And then we'll exploit also variation in gender bias across space, so by comparing municipalities with more or less gender discrimination. So let's kill the suspense and give you a quick preview of the results. So first, with regard to the model, so it will be a simple model where we will introduce some gender bias. Namely, we will assume that voters judge female leaders more harshly. And to do that, we'll assume that voters expect policies to be less efficient if implemented by a female politician. So this is to say that they will give less credit to female leaders for the same actions and decisions. And with this simple assumption, we will show you that it generates a testable prediction and, importantly, opposing prediction depending on voters' belief about the crisis. So first, when voters believe that the crisis is unlikely to happen, when there is uncertainty about whether the crisis will hit, then we can show that female mayors have a lower incentive to undertake a containment effort. So here you can think early beginning of the pandemic, February, March, we had no idea how bad COVID was. In that type of context, female politicians will have a lower incentive to implement policy. On the reverse, when voters believe that the crisis is real, when they know the consequences, then we will show that female politicians have a higher incentive to implement containment policies. You can think after the first wave, once we've seen the consequences of COVID. And so here the intuition is that female politicians are judged more harshly and are more likely to be punished for doing too much when we don't know how bad COVID is, and for doing too little once we know that we need to address the crisis. Now we test this main prediction in the Brazilian setting, and consistent with the model prediction, we find that at the early beginning of the pandemic, we see more COVID-19 deaths in female-led municipalities, and we see that female mayors were less likely to close the economy, less likely to close non-essential businesses. On the reverse, at the end of the year 2020, this time we see fewer deaths in female-led municipalities, and we see that female mayors were more likely to close non-essential businesses. So there is this reversal in time that is predicted by the model, and that already says that it's unlikely to be a pure preference story. If you assume that female leaders have a higher preference for protecting health over the economy, we should find consistently that they close the economy more often than male leaders. So this reversal is already showing that it's unlikely to be purely preference-based, and it's consistent with the model. Now, to provide additional evidence that it's a story about electoral incentives and voters' bias, we run a heterogeneity analysis. And first, I will show you that the gender differences we find are only driven by mayors who are facing re-election, only by non-term limited mayors. In other words, if you look at term limited mayors who are not facing their voters, we do not see gender differences anymore. Female and male mayors behave the same. And then I will also show you that the impact is larger in municipalities where you expect voters' bias to be the larger. So in municipalities where, for instance, the gender wage gap on the labor market is higher, So municipality where we see more gender discrimination, we see that female leaders tend to behave more differently than male leaders. And so this is showing that they're responding to voter bias rather than to their intrinsic preferences. Any question? Yes.
Just about, like, I guess with how an RD we're looking at counties or municipalities where it's very close between, I'm assuming, like a male or female mayor. How can I think about, I would assume that there might be municipalities that are so patriarchal that they were just never going to elect a female mayor. And it just that those might be dissimilar from those where there's like a close election for gender.
Yes, no, so that's a great question about external validity, right? So our sample, as you say, is focusing on close election between female and male candidates. So we are first restricting to places where the top 2 candidates are one man and one woman, right? So in some sense, it's working a bit against us because these are municipalities that are already not too gender biased, not to vote for a woman at all. So you could think about those results are lower bound because we're in a setting where these are perhaps the municipality the least gender discriminatory. Well, then you have municipality that might vote 100% for women. There are fewer, unfortunately, but so that's how you could see that. Yes.
So I think this is to generalize to the entire electoral landscape, but I'm trying to generalize to you set up initially like gender preferences in general.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think that about Brazil, I think the most elected officials are male, and that's so that there might be a higher selection into being elected among female than male elected officials. So how is that affecting the ability when I'm trying to extrapolate this to other gender differences? The fact that those elected officials are highly selected on some qualities.
Right.
To get elected, but to size to get elected, maybe they have to behave in a way that is less expected of the typical women in the country to appeal to the preference of the.
Right. So it's true. I mean, first we're in a setting, as you said, there are only 20%, right, of municipalities where you have a female mayor. I mean, it's true worldwide that we have underrepresentation in politics. So these are contexts where it's particularly challenging to be a female leader. Now we're also in a context where incentives perhaps matter a lot, right? These are people who want to get elected, they are selected into politics. So it also means that they're not afraid of competing and of the challenge, which is perhaps so then not the mechanism that would contradict our results. So we're in a setting where you have high incentive to respond to voters, right? If you want to get elected for a politician. So this is perhaps the setting where it's the easiest to detect this. What I want to show in this paper is that I'm not saying there is no story of preferences. Now, of course, we can always, ask where preferences are coming from, and they could be endogenous to the stereotype. I just want to show that there is room for incentives. And so so that incentive play a role. And so as long as there is some gender norms, some gender stereotypes, and as long as you have some incentive, and I guess in the workplace, you have lots of incentive, right, when you want to negotiate your salary, and stuff like this. So as long as there is some incentive, and as long as there are gender stereotypes, I think this mechanism could play a role. But I would love to do research in other areas than politics to show that. Yeah.
For your second point, so you show that second part, they're more likely to close relative to people who also closed earlier. It's just relative to other males.
So it's related to other males during the same period.
Okay, it could just be a trend that if you closed earlier, you're less likely to close later.
Right. So you're asking whether basically this is just a byproduct of the first period. So first, just a step back regarding death. You could also think that more death at the beginning could mechanically lead to lower death at the end. For instance, if you reach immunity or if the most vulnerable people already died. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, we see many more deaths in relative term, but in absolute term, it's really a low number of deaths because the virus is at low level. And we actually show that there is no correlation between death at this period and at the end of the period over all municipalities because it's just too few deaths to create immunity or anything. So there is no correlation between death at the beginning and death at the end. And then regarding containment policies, interestingly, this is a policy that was used with a lot of flexibility. So they were opening, closing up, opening, closing up. So it's not the case that they close for a given period and then reopen. They really did it on and off. And that was actually a huge complaint in Brazil about the local business owners who said it was very disruptive. Yes.
And you might have said there, but did they do school closures in Brazil? And do you see any difference in school closure policy as opposed to just non-essential business closures?
Yes, so I will show you which policies we are looking at. We do have school closure. We're not looking at this because there is just no variation across municipality and across time. They all close school about at the same time and really almost evenly across the country. So we'll focus on 6 policies for which we have enough variation across time and municipality. Same for face masks. They just all, mandated face masks at the same time. But I will talk about policy. All right, so I want to have time to get to all of it, so I will be quick on the lit review. I just want to emphasize that we contribute to 3 main strands of the literature. The first one in economics, like a large literature showing empirically gender differences in leaders' behavior that is particularly robust in developing countries. And so here, going beyond documenting differences between female and male leaders, what we're really interested in is shedding new light on where they stem from. And so by doing this, we link this literature to another huge literature about the presence of others' gender discrimination. And this is actually the study of gender norms, gender stereotypes. It's not well done in economics, and it's mostly in sociology, political science, or psychology, where you have, for instance, evidence of this congruency theory that says that basically the attributes you give to leaders, like assertiveness, strength, are typically not attributes that you give to women, making it hard for voters to see women as strong and good leaders. And so what we show in this paper is that this voter bias can create incentives for female and male leaders to behave differently. And so we're thus also linking this literature to the large literature on the impact of electoral incentives for the behavior of leaders that usually empirically leverage term limited versus non-term limited. Here we show that basically electoral incentives matter both for male and female politicians. They both want to get reelected and adjust their policy, but differently due to the presence of voters' bias. So I will now go through the model. Then I will present the empirical setting and strategy. I will then show gender differences in crisis response over time and end up with the heterogeneity analysis. So we're in a society where with a mass 1 of voters and 1 politician, and voters derive utility from the consumption of a public good, which in our case can denote health, and it is denoted G. Now, in normal times, the amount of public good is fully predictable. It's G bar. But there is a crisis that threatens the public good, and that will reduce the public good according to this expression, where psi is the shock to the public good. And so again, they will only be able to consume G. Now, there exist containment policies that can mitigate the incoming shock, and it will mitigate them depending on P, which will be the level of containment policy. This will be the choice variable of the politician. And then it will also mitigate the impact of the shock depending on the effectiveness of the policy at containing the shock, lambda. Now, voters, they derive positive utility from consuming the public good G, but they also derive negative direct disutility from containment policies. So here, this is the usual trade-off, right, of containment policies. So on the one hand, containment policies will help preserve the public good, which is valued by voters. But on the other hand, it will also limit their freedom, which is not valued. And this is the cost of public policy. So importantly here, you can see that the cost of public policy is entering multiplying G, meaning that if you expect a very large public good, so if you expect that the crisis won't be that bad, then policies will be particularly costly. On the reverse, if you expect a low public good, if you expect that the crisis will hit hard and that you will only end up with a low public good, then you value containment policy and the cost of containment policy is lower. So this is to capture the higher willingness of voters to accept containment policy when they expect the crisis to be harmed. Now here you can see that it's G tilde, so it's the anticipated public good level, right? So voters have uncertainty about how much of the public good will be left after the crisis and containment policies. And the whole belief about the extent of the crisis and about the effectiveness of containment policies. So first, there is some uncertainty about how effective containment policies will be at containing the crisis. And here voters have gender bias expectation. Namely, they expect policies to be less effective if decided by a female leader. So they will attribute a policy effectiveness lambda F to a female leader that is lower than lambda M for male leaders. And so this is to capture the fact that women would get less credit for the same policy decisions. Now, they also hold belief on the likelihood of the shock, and they think that the shock psi will happen with probability P. So only when P is equal to 1, they think that the full shock will hit. So then we can rewrite voter utility by replacing G tilde. And so you can see that it will, of course, depend on the amount of policy chosen by the politician, on the amount of the shock, but also on their belief of policy effectiveness that is gender dependent, and on the probability that they assign to the shock. Now the politician, it's easy. The politician just wants to maximize their re-election probability. That's their only objective. And this is an unobserved positive function of voters' utility. So the best they can do is to choose P so that it will maximize voters' utility. So if you maximize the previous expression with respect to P, you obtain P star. And so as you can see, the optimal level of policy P star will be linearly increasing in the amount of the shock, in the probability that voters give to the shock, and will non-linearly depend on policy effectiveness. And so here we are interested to know how P star will vary depending on whether it's a female or a male politician. And so here the only thing that is gender dependent in the model is lambda policy effectiveness. So we will ask how it varies with lambda S. Importantly, the effect of lambda S on P will be mediated by P times psi, which is the amount of the shock voters believe will happen. And so we'll look at two situations, one in which you have a low P. So voters attribute a low probability to the crisis. You can think early beginning of the pandemic when there was a lot of uncertainty. And another situation with high P, they're quite confident that the crisis will hit. You can think about later in the year 2020 once we know the health consequences. And so this is the key comparative statics. So here on the left, you have a low belief on the shock. So for instance, 25% confidence that the shock will happen. And here, high belief in the shock, P is equal to 75%. And here I plot the optimal amount of policy chosen by the politician, P star, as a function of lambda S, which is the expected effectiveness from the voter's perspective. And so remember that female leaders are assigned a lower lambda S. You can think, for instance, lambda is equal to 2, whereas male leaders have a higher one. For instance, lambda is equal to 4. And so here you can see that under low belief in the shock, there is an increasing relationship. So the higher lambda, the higher P star, meaning that in this case, female leaders with a lower lambda will implement a lower level of policy. Now, if you look at the other situation under a high belief in the shock, then this is the reverse. There is a decreasing relationship, and here male politician will implement a lower level than female politician. So let me maybe give you a bit more of intuition about why we have this result. So in the first case, there is a low belief in the shock. So we don't know whether COVID will actually happen, whether it will be detrimental for society. And so in this case, voters are less willing to accept containment policies and to accept to have their freedom reduced because we don't know whether it's necessary or not. And they are even less willing to accept containment policies if it's implemented by female leaders who are seen as less efficient. Now, on the reverse, when you have a high belief in the likelihood of the shock, we know how deadly COVID is, then voters are more willing to accept containment policies. Now they know it's needed. And in this case, female politicians need to do more to compensate for voter skepticism about their effectiveness. So you can think about this as female leaders are more likely to be punished for doing the wrong thing. So they're more likely to be punished for doing too much when we don't know whether we need policies. And they're more likely to be punished for doing too little when we know how deadly COVID is. Yes.
But your model doesn't need there to be a quality difference in the candidates, right? Like as you can imagine in a setting like yours, that the female mayors, but to even get to that point, might need to be better in some way, right? But in here, they're just sort of the quality performance we assume to be about the same between the two, and then it's all driven by the discrimination that doesn't have, there's no rational basis for the discrimination, right? They're just,
Right. So you're right.
it's not like they observe them performing differently and then subsequently have that belief. No, right?
No. So politicians are completely similar.
Got
The
it.
only difference there is in the model is the way voters perceive them.
Got it.
Now, I will talk to your point about the fact that when you have gender discrimination, in order
Usually,
to
yeah.
be elected, you need to be better. And so this will be more of an empirical question that I will try to address to show you that the results are not driven by difference in quality.
Got it.
Yes.
So for this, I think we're looking at just this sort of binary of like, whether you do this policy. So I'm just, like, or I guess, have you thought about like, there may be varying effectiveness or varying like voters attributing effectiveness to female or male mayors may vary on the type of policy, or maybe voters are patriarchal and they give more effectiveness towards policy that affects families, or maybe it's health for women. And so then female mayors might then have incentives to vary the types of policies they use if they know they're going to get more credit out of like specific policies. Is something that
That's very interesting. So I mean, in this context, we just talk about containment policy in general. You see the one on which they differ empirically. Now we think in this context that, it's containment policies in general. So we don't think there is much room for how you perceive whether like it's about closing non-essential businesses or closing public transport, for instance. Now, taking a step back, I fully agree. Actually, in the congruency theory, they show that voters evaluate female leaders less favorably in general, but even more so based on economics, or war or crisis. So we're in a context of a crisis where you can think that it's even more biased in the sense that you want a strong leader and that people generally don't attribute strengths to women as much as men. They also show that instead on policies related to education or health, women are perceived more favorably. Not necessarily more favorably than men, but at least not less favorably. And this actually, I mean, I'm going beyond my paper or anything, but this actually could rationalize why we see that female politicians invest more in education and health. Again, maybe it's not their preferences, it's just to conform to voters' expectations about what they should do, right? So I fully agree that depending on the policies, you could have different effects. In this case, we think about containment policies as one. Oh, you have, yeah.
Just a quick one. In the first case, the low belief.
Yeah.
Is it, are you able to disentangle that voters think that the female politicians are less effective versus they're stereotyping that females are more risk averse? So they're like rushing to close the stores. Oh, that's so typical of women. Like they can't handle any kind of like risk level. Like it's like two different stereotypes. Like one is that they're not effective, policies they implement are not effective, and the other is they're too risk averse. Maybe it doesn't matter, they're kind of observationally equivalent. But.
I mean, that's interesting indeed. I mean, there is evidence in experimental literature that they're more risk averse. So you're saying that maybe just that voters are more likely to punish them for doing things too quickly, than men. I think, it would be observably equivalent, and I would be happy with that. Or, those historical like women who like close way too early, whereas for a man, it's a sign of strength. I think it's just a bit harder to model or to have this, but I mean, yes, as long as it could also explain the later effect. So we wanted to find something that could explain both the early and the late, and this is why we capture it this way. But I would also be comfortable with other interpretation.
Yeah, we would side comment on something you said earlier about women spending more on education and health. That's also true in households.
Mhm.
The more spending power we would have, the more the House spends on education and health. Actually.
Yeah, and so I mean, again, it's an open question. Is it like totally preferences or it is what society expects from them? I mean, you know, for instance, at daycare, they still call me all the time to tell me my kid has a runny nose or stuff where I told them explicitly my husband is working at home. You know, so that's the type of thing that then, you know, makes me more likely to maybe like spend on health for my daughter because I'm the one people call.
Your husband's number first.
I mean, you can try everything. Maybe we should change names. You know? Yeah.
Sorry, this is a slightly different version of Thomas' point,
Yeah.
but like, what if there's like men and women are facing, you know, different amounts of weight on empirical evidence, so initially there's not much evidence around payment policies, and so if you proceed cautiously, you don't pursue them as aggressively, yet as the pandemic goes on, it becomes very clear that containment is in fact like a very important public health measure, such that you start to do it more, and men are just like more impulsive, like gut-based decision-making than they are empirical.
Right. So yeah, that could be, you know, women are more likely to wait and learn versus men who are more likely to act fast. Now, this would not be an interpretation based on voters. This would be an interpretation just based on like female and male leaders doing differently. And so here, the test I have for this is to compare term limited to not term limited. If you expect women leaders to always behave more cautiously, they should do it independently whether they face re-election or not, right? And so the fact that they behave this way only when they face re-election is a sign that it's like to respond to voters rather than only like for their own, the way they perceive things, right? Does it answer?
Yeah, because I mean, I guess the thing about the model is like it rules out, it hardwires in your own explanation rather than like permitting there to be potential differences across politicians that you could then rule out as an explanation for like subsequent tests.
Yeah, so
it's more like a rationalization of the findings than it is like a presentation of possible, I don't know, possible differences that could exist, one being preference based and another being.
Yeah, I just think that all the preference based are like, you have huge number of different, you know, risk aversion, you could have like preferences over health, you could have weight and learn, and these are hard to capture because then they have very different prediction, and just making a list of all those preferences. So it's true, the way we thought about it is, let's have a model that would predict what happens if you only have this channel. Let's test this and then rule out using heterogeneity analysis. But I fully agree, I take the comment, it's not a model that generates prediction for all types of explanation. I will root them out after. I think the main prediction is first this reversal that already rolls out quite a bit, but not the one you gave that I think will be ruled out by heterogeneity analysis. So as I just said, oh yes, sorry.
So just one more quick thing. In the figure on the slide before, can we compare sort of the y-axis on the left plot to the, so I'm also curious kind of in the over time comparison. And so here could we say men are actually more likely to implement the policies earlier on than later on, just not compared to women, but just among men before and after, basically. So.
Oh yes. So yes, I mean, I will show you the mean in the tables, right? So at the early beginning, you have a fewer amount of policy than at the end.
Okay, among men.
Among men, because the mean will be among men.
And because, okay, now I see the y-axis. So
yeah, so here, you know, it goes up to 35,
okay,
here it goes up to 85. And that's the idea that the amount of policy is linearly increasing with the amount of the shock and the perceived probability of the shock. So the main prediction, mapping this into time, would be that female politicians undertake less containment effort at the beginning, more towards the end. All right, so let's turn to the empirical setting. We'll look at Brazilian municipalities. As I said, we have over 5,000 municipalities in Brazil. They're federal entities, so mayors could independently decide over containment policies. Mayors are elected every 4 years, and there is a hard two-term limit. So here for the study period, the treatment will be based on the last election before COVID, 2016. And then the mayor elected in 2016 enters into office in January 2017 until the end of 2020. And so our outcomes will be throughout the year 2020, from February, the first COVID case in Brazil, until January 21, when the new mayor enters into office. And so we look at outcomes during the last year of the tenure of the mayor. So in terms of data for COVID-19 deaths, This comes from Brazil.io. It's an open data platform that collects and harmonizes COVID-19 data coming from health state secretaries. We also test the robustness to CVAP data coming from the Ministry of Health, coming from hospitals. And what is nice is that they have a category about severe respiratory syndromes that encompass, but is not limited to COVID. And so we can also test the robustness to a measure that is that does not rely on COVID testing. Now, for containment policies, we constructed a new data set directly from laws and decrees issued by municipalities. So municipalities in Brazil, and particularly the largest one, are automatically releasing their laws and decrees online on like dedicated websites. And so we scrapped all those laws and decrees. We extracted the text and we did text analysis to know which policy was in place in a given municipality on a given day. So we have daily data on which policy was implemented. Here it's available for 50% of the sample for the largest municipality that systematically publish their decrees online.
Sorry, and that's not related to like the effort of the mayor's office.
What do you mean effort?
Like a term limited mayor may have no interest, like they're just gonna implement policies and there's no interest in putting out press releases around them to inform voters about whether or not they're in place.
Right.
You're saying this is like systematic, it's mechanical that.
And it's not a press release, it's really just a decree. I mean, voters are not, I mean, it's not something that is meant for voters. It's more like legal documents that they put on their, like on their website online. It's not, I mean, from anecdotal evidence, it's quite unlikely that people are looking at them. It's not about like making a press release, right? So we're not using press release. They might, as you said, right, go to the press to say, look what we have done and etc. And this may vary by electoral incentive or by gender. Here, it's really only the legal document. And it was quite hard to extract the text and analyze them. So I won't expect people to just read them on the weekend. Like it's not very digestible documents.
Can you distinguish the types of containment policies?
Yeah, sure. I will go into this in the results. I will present you the different types of containment policy. So for the sample, as I said, we have to focus on municipalities where the top two contenders in 2016 are one man and one woman. Then we exclude municipalities part of Arenvos Populacionais. So I don't know if we have Portuguese speaking in the room. Sorry for my accent. These are urban conglomerates formed by more than one municipality. So here the idea is that if you're part of these conglomerates, then you are linked with your neighboring municipalities through commuting flows and common transport policies. And so the number of deaths that you are experiencing is tightly linked to the number of deaths in nearby municipalities and to the decisions made by nearby mayors. And so by excluding the 19% of those municipalities, we can focus on municipalities where we can directly link COVID-19 outcomes to the decisions of the mayors. So we have a final sample of 981 municipalities, and I can show you that they are very similar as the rest of Brazilian municipalities when it comes to the evolution. I cannot show you. Okay. So you have to trust me. When you look at the evolution of COVID-19 deaths, both in level and in the trend, they're very similar to the average Brazilian municipality. So municipalities in the analysis sample. So here in blue, you have places that elected a female leader, in red, a male leader. You can see we have municipalities all over the country in every Brazilian state, and we don't see any particular geographical pattern between female and male municipalities. Some summary statistics, I won't go through all of them, it's just to show you which type of variables first we use for the balance test and second as control to increase the precision of the estimation. Just to give you an idea, an average municipality in our sample is 14,000 inhabitants. Now we include a lot of variables that have been shown to predict COVID, the share of population above 65 years old, the number of nursing home residents, the distance to international airports, informality rate, for instance. We also have political variables, so turnout is particularly high in Brazil because it's mandatory to vote in Brazil. And then we also have the vote share at the municipal level of Bolsonaro in the 2018 election to capture alignment with the president. So we use a regression discontinuity design. So we will compare municipalities where a woman versus a man was closely elected. Our running variable will be the victory margin of the female candidate. So then it's positive if the female candidate won and the treatment is equal to 1. It's negative if the female candidate lost and the treatment is equal to 0. We run a non-parametric estimation. So we fit 2 local linear regressions on each side of the threshold, and the difference of the intercept will be the treatment effect, the effect of having a female mayor. We include all the municipal controls I show you in the table to increase the precision of the estimate. We test for not including control or including more of them. Yes.
Just to clarify, did it say some places had up to 9 candidates, or are these all going to be sort of second round one of the elections, or there are different numbers?
Yeah, so the average number of candidates is 2.6, and yes, so it goes up to 9. So it will, in our sample, it will be only 1 round election. Okay. So this is the margin between the top 2. So it's not necessarily 51% versus 49. We use optimal data-driven bandwidth that will vary by outcome and also robust confidence intervals. So the identification assumption here is that as you cross the threshold, the only thing that changes across municipalities at the threshold is the gender of the mayor. So to provide supporting evidence for this, we show that there is no discontinuity in the vote margin of the female candidate. And we also run balance tests. So on all those 19 characteristics I showed you, there is only 1 out of 19 that is significant at the 10%. And when we do a general balance test to test for the joint significance of all those variables, we do not see any jump at the threshold. So basically, we are confident that at the threshold, it's as if gender was randomly assigned to municipalities. Now, it's not because gender is randomly assigned that we can necessarily interpret what we find as a gender effect if you think that other characteristics of the winner is correlated with gender. So for instance, if female candidates are always more likely to be on the left, then we might capture an ideology effect rather than a gender effect. And so here we take as outcome not municipal characteristics, but the characteristics of the winner. So we have incumbency, age, race, education, occupation. And then for ideology, we have a score on the left-right axis. We have dummies for the center and center-right parties, which are the 2 main parties in Brazil in the election, and a dummy for the historical left party, the PT. So as you can see, for ideology, like the coefficients are small and not significant. This is also true for most of the variables, with maybe one notable exception, which is higher education. So it's not significant, but you can see that the coefficient is quite large. That suggests that closely elected female mayors are on average more educated than closely elected male mayors. So coming back, Ceci, to your point, this is consistent with the fact that there is gender discrimination, because in order to have the same vote share as the men, right? So we're comparing male and female leaders who basically have the same vote share. To compensate for gender discrimination, you have to be better. So you have to be higher ability. Now, we're confident that the fact that there may be higher ability or higher education is not driving the effect, because when we control for it and when we control for all those characteristics, we do not find any differences in the main results. We do a second exercise where we look only at men, and we do an RDD on highly educated versus non-highly educated men to look at the effect of education only, and we do not find any impact on COVID. So it does not seem that the education of the mayor was a driving force behind COVID policies. So all this to say that we're confident that we can interpret our results as a gender effect. Yeah.
So of these variables, which ones map onto effectiveness of implementing policy the most? Because that's really like the thing that balance matters for the most, to rule out like that it's something else that correlates with gender. So I think incumbent matters and politics. So that means that is that like the closest thing to like years of experience in holding office? Or
yeah, we have another measure, but the sample becomes small. But in the paper, we have also whether you served as a municipal councillor in the term before, meaning you were already, part of the municipality, like policy making during the last term. We don't find differences either. So yeah, I would say that incumbency, maybe age, if you think it's, linked with experience, education, which would be correlated with ability, and whether you worked in politics before. And importantly, incumbency, there is no difference, which is important for the term limited versus non-term limited heterogeneity analysis, because it means that there is no selection when we condition on term limit. All right, so let's now turn to the result. We first look at gender differences in crisis response over time. And so our first and maybe main outcome will be the number of deaths. So here, remember, we're comparing municipalities that are similar in every aspect except the gender of their mayor. So if we see difference in deaths, it's likely coming from the action of the mayor. And then to corroborate this, we'll look at policies. So remember the main prediction, less containment effort at the beginning, more at the end. So we start with deaths here. These are daily effects. So each dot on the solid blue line is the impact of having a female mayor on the total number of deaths up to this day. So this is the cumulative number of deaths up to a given day per 10,000 inhabitants. And so here you see different patterns at the beginning and at the end. So at the beginning of the period, in particular May and June, you see positive and significant coefficients, meaning more deaths in female-led municipalities. Then it's non-significant, it reverts back to 0 before turning negative at the end of the period, meaning this time fewer deaths in female-led municipalities. So to better understand what's going on here, we looked at the effect also month by month, so total number of deaths month by month or period by period. So I wanted to click on this graph to show you the trend of deaths in Brazil, but basically period 1 would be April, May. This is really the beginning of the first wave when deaths started to rise. Then you have the summer. This is the peak of the first wave, which was particularly deadly in Brazil. September, October is the end of the first wave. And then November, January is the beginning of the second wave. And so what you can see here is that having a female mayor led to 0.5 more deaths per 10,000 inhabitants in the first period, which basically, this is the mean for men municipalities at the threshold. So it's times 4 compared to male municipalities. So it's huge in magnitude compared to male municipalities, but it's still a small number in like number of actual deaths. Yes.
How does this track with any kind of policy, or I guess maybe not policy changes at the national, but the messaging changes? Like Bolsonaro was very, vocal about various things in the pandemic, and I wondered if there's some interaction between, because you have, this thing happening over time, that the national level policies might be interacting with how voters are perceiving the various policies that have been implemented at the municipality level.
Yeah, so I mean, throughout 2020, there hasn't been much change in Bolsonaro's stance on COVID. I mean, he was generally quite in denial about COVID.
The whole period.
Yeah, I mean, we're only looking at 2020, right? So, I mean, starting in 21, when you have vaccination, I mean, everything started to be more complicated. I think it's also the case that things started a bit later in Brazil, precisely due, so that's why the uncertainty about the crisis was particularly true at the beginning of COVID, because Bolsonaro, was still saying it was only a flu and so on. Now, we don't think that alignment with Bolsonaro is different in female or male municipalities, because they are balanced in how much they voted for Bolsonaro. So it's not the case that voters are more like inclined to follow Bolsonaro in one type of municipality or the other. Now, we could run heterogeneity analysis based on how much they're aligned with Bolsonaro. I think it would a bit overlap with the gender discrimination one, but that could be another test. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
2 questions. One, have you run this sort of like the age-adjusted mortality or something like that? I know your balance is not that big of a concern, but
no, so we don't have data on like exactly who is getting it. Not in our main data source. We could do it with CVET if we wanted. As you said, like we're balanced on like age and stuff like this, so we don't think like the structure of the population would explain.
I guess, and then the other question, just it looks like the female mayor's response in terms of mortality seems better. Like it's like closer to what, so and also your model almost could have like an optimal lambda, an optimal trust level. So is it almost suggesting that they're trusting the male mayors too much to deviate from policy, or?
So you're saying they're doing better?
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, I mean, it depends what you say by what you mean by better. I mean, they're following more closely what voters worked in some sense, like voters' acceptance of containment policy, right? So the less voters accept policy, the less they are going to do those policies. The more voters are likely to accept those policies, the more they will do it. And I'm not sure it's better to follow more voters, but
you have your deaths, so.
yeah, so at the very end, so if you look on net over 2020, you have at the end fewer deaths in female and municipalities. It's not significant, so I would not like put everything I have on this. But now what I find interesting is that the conclusion differs a lot. So if you are a researcher ending your study period in August, it's bad to have a female mayor, right? If you're a researcher ending your study period in January 21, it's good. I don't know about January 22, right? So it's to say that it's really following voters. I'm not sure it's following what necessarily has to be done. So if voters are wrong, then as you see, it's detrimental for the number of deaths. Again, I'm making no sense of what should have been done, but. So beginning of the period, 4 times more deaths in female-led municipalities. At the end of the period, on the reverse, we have 1 fewer deaths per 10,000 inhabitants, and this is a reduction of about 42% compared to male-led municipalities. There is no significant effect in the second and third period, but you do see this reversal. So basically, the estimate here basically goes to 0 in the second period before turning negative, and then highly negative and significant. So we do see this reversal in time. So again, because municipalities are balanced on every characteristics, this suggests that female and male mayors handled the crisis differently, leading to more deaths at the beginning, fewer at the end. So now we look at which policies they adopted during this period. So here we look to come back to your question at mainly 6 policies for which we have enough variation across municipalities. So this is not including school or mask mandate, which were really adopted by everyone at the same time. So commerce restriction, which is you close non-essential businesses. Curfew, lockdown, very few actually went to implement those more strict policies. Travel restriction, if you close like the boundary of your municipality. Public transport restriction and workplace restriction. So you close offices. And so here you can see that commerce restriction really stands out with a large negative coefficient at the beginning and positive at the end. So here, the outcome is just a dummy equal to 1 if on a given day, non-essential businesses were closed. And so here you see that they're less likely to be closed at the beginning of the period when you have a female mayor, and they become more likely to be closed at the end of the period. So the fact that we have effect mainly on this policy is consistent with the fact that it's basically the main instrument used by mayors during this time period. So this is the first policy they started to use. This is also the one they use with the most flexibility. So as I said at the beginning, opening up, closing, opening up again, and closing. So it was really the primary instrument they used, but with a lot of heterogeneity across mayors. Now we can look month by month. So here the outcome in the number of days during which non-essential businesses were closed. And you can see that they were closed 3 days less in female-led municipalities in March, and almost 10 days less in April. Whereas on the reverse, here you see that they were closed 8 days more in September, October. So interestingly, when you look at the mean, you see that it increases a lot over the summer, right? When you have a lot of deaths, when the crisis became more important, it started to decrease after because male mayors started to be more likely to lift restriction. So this positive effect is female mayors being less likely to lift restriction after the first wave. And this here is female mayors being more likely to delay the start of containment policy. So they waited on average 2 months more to start closing non-essential businesses. But then after the first wave, they were less likely to lift restrictions compared to male mayors. So you can also see that on the RDD graph. So here, each dot is the average of the outcome variable, number of days with commerce restriction on the given bin of the running variable. On the right-hand side, positive value, meaning female mayors, left-hand side, male mayors. Here you can see this downward jump here that is even bigger in April, so less likely to close at the beginning. This is still negative in May, but it started to close in June. July is basically 0, and then it started to turn into a positive jump, so more likely to close, that is significant in September, October. So you do see this reversal month by month. less likely to close at the beginning, and more so at the end. Also, if you like interpreting shapes of the fit, you can see that as you go away from the discontinuity, the effects disappear, which is consistent with electoral incentives driving the result, right? So the more contested the election is, the more you are afraid for your re-election and the higher the electoral incentives. So beginning of the period, female-led municipalities experienced more COVID-19 deaths, and female mayors were less likely to close non-essential businesses. So I won't draw any causal relationship between non-essential businesses and death, just the timing aligned quite well. And we can see that it's due to a higher likelihood to delay commerce closure. At the end of the period, we see fewer deaths in female-led municipalities, and female mayors were more likely to close non-essential businesses. So this is robust to a wide range of controls, to including state fixed effects and to varying the bandwidth or the polynomial order. All right, so this is basically consistent with the main prediction of the model. As I said at the beginning, it's in contradiction with purely a preference story, like preference of health over the economy, or the reverse. Now, to provide further evidence that it's a story about electoral incentives and voter bias, I will now run additional heterogeneity analysis. So I will test two additional model implications. The first one is that gender differences are only driven by electorally motivated mayors. So to come back to your question, indeed, our model was only focusing on this particular explanation, and the only gender-dependent term is the way voters see female and male leaders, right? And this matters only if you want to get re-elected. And so the first test is that we will compare mayors who are term limited or not term limited. And the second test is to compare the effect depending on the competitiveness of the race in 2016. So here we cannot use our RDD, we will use less well-identified OLS. And the second implication of the model is that gender differences are larger in places where voters are more likely to be gender biased. So again, in the model, the higher the difference between lambda F and lambda M, between the perceived effectiveness of female and male mayor, the higher the difference in the choice of their policies. And so the more voters are gender biased, the more they perceive female leaders differently, the more female leaders have an incentive to behave differently. And so here we'll compare municipalities with lower versus higher gender discrimination. So first, electoral incentives. So here in columns 1 and 2, these are the effects in period 1 and in period 4 that I showed you on the full sample. So more death at the beginning, fewer at the end. Column 3 and 4, I only include mayor who can run in the 2020 election. So they are not the incumbent, they can run again. Column 5 and 6, they cannot run again, they're the incumbent. And so as you can see here, the effects are large and significant. Positive in period 1, negative in period 4, only when the mayor can run for re-election. So here we're entering into small samples, so it's not the most precise estimation. Still, the difference in period 1 is significant. It's not significant in period 4. So basically, gender differences here are only driven by electorally motivated mayors. We do not see differences in death when we look at those who are term limited. Now, the other test we do, as I said, is just to run an OLS. So here we take the full sample, we include all the controls in terms of municipality controls and winner controls. We regress the number of COVID deaths in each period on the treatment, having a female mayor. And we also include an interaction between having a female mayor and the vote margin in 2016. So the idea that if in 2016 you're elected with a very small margin, then the electoral incentives are high. It's a competitive seat, so you really want to please voters to get re-elected. On the reverse, if the vote margin is super large, let's say you were elected with 80%, I mean, you're safe, and so you need less to cater to voters' expectations. So here first, when you look at the effect of the treatment, you see it's always positive in period 1, always negative in period 4, but it starts to be large and significant only when you start restricting the sample to close elections won by a vote margin lower than 10 or 5 percentage points. More interestingly, the interaction is always of the reverse sign. Negative in period 1, positive in period 4. What does it mean? It means that as you increase the vote margin, so as you go from a very competitive to a less competitive election, you decrease the treatment effect. So the effect here is more deaths in female municipalities in period 1, but as you go away from the discontinuity, as you go to less contested election, the effect drops to 0. In period 4, it's fewer deaths in female municipalities, but again, as you increase the vote margin and you go away from the discontinuity, the effect drops to 0. So this is to show that the impact on deaths is higher the more competitive the election is. And I think it's an important takeaway for all the studies looking at gender differences using RDD in elections. Because by default, we are looking only at very competitive elections. And so if you think gender differences are due to electoral incentives, we are perhaps capturing gender differences that would not hold in less contested elections.
Let's say I'm clear, so this is the same, just set of municipalities. So still like closed elections, but just like varying how.
So here, yes, so here it's all of them. Here it's a closed election, like vote margin of lower than 10% and then 5%.
Is 10% like the boundary that?
Yeah, it's about which is reassuring, right? Because 10% is basically the bandwidth usually that we use in the estimation. And as you can see, the treatment effect is very close to what we have with the RDD, right? So it means also that our controls are doing a good job at capturing other characteristics of the winner and municipal characteristics. Yes.
Sorry, I might have totally missed something, but at the beginning you were saying like the female politicians are punished more they're punished more for doing too little at the beginning and for doing too much at the end, right?
I know that's the reverse.
Sorry, the reverse.
Yeah.
But so far these outcomes are about like health data. So like, how do we know how the voters are responding, that they're actually being punished?
Right. So here, basically the whole paper, we're not actually directly measuring how voters perceive them. We're just outlining predictions about how they would behave if this is the mechanism. And we're showing you that indeed they're behaving the way we would expect them if they're driven by the way voters see them.
I see.
Now, being more, I mean, you can interpret the way we model discrimination different ways, being more punished, being judged more harshly, having less credit for the action. I mean, anything that means that you will get closer to what voters expect, given the crisis severity. The last heterogeneity goes a bit more into voters' bias. But again, this is not direct evidence of voter bias. This is to show you that the way they behave is consistent. And the fact that it's only driven by those facing their voters and only in competitive election is also consistent with this. Yes.
How do you want us to think about, so if we're thinking about your main results as being, you know, this is a local average treatment effect. If the average treatment effect for this would be that there is no treatment effect of having a female mayor unless there is some sort of electoral competitiveness. Is that?
Yes.
And then
So
this sample, is this always contested? So there's no uncontested municipalities in this?
no, so this is always you have one man, one woman as top two, right? Yes. Yes. So here what
About the, sorry, the local, the average treatment effect is more along the lines of your like more competitive, like, I guess, how do you want us to think about what the?
yeah, so
treatment
basically my point here is that, I mean, in this context at least, what it suggests is that if you look at elections where there is no electoral incentive, so either I'm not planning on running again, I cannot run again, or if I run again, I'm 100% sure I'm going to win. Meaning like I don't have strong incentive to really follow voters' expectation, then I would not expect gender differences in how they handle the crisis. I'm not saying this is true in any context. Here it's a crisis context where you can look at exactly one policy on which voters are going to assess you. So this is very convenient. In other contexts, I'm not saying that there is no preference difference on other policy they might, but at least in this context, this would be my interpretation. Yes.
Can you go back to the previous table? So here comparing columns, I guess 4 and 6.
Yes, and 3 and 5.
The mean left of the threshold is very, very different, right? Across those two, where the mayors can run again and cannot run again in period 4.
Yes.
It's much, much higher, right? So is that, would you say that's just sort of bad luck given the sample, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will need to check also by you know, given the size of the sample, it could be bad luck, but just having like one observation very close to the, now I could also try to have exactly the same bandwidth for both, because they're not exactly, you know, having the bandwidth is outcome and sample dependent.
Yeah.
So yes, I
Just
will
right
need.
now, right, could we say perhaps it's not driven by whether you can run again, but it's just by the severity of COVID in your municipality, actually, right? Where in column 4, it's much more severe in those municipalities than it is in column 6, right?
Yeah, at the same time, when you look at column 1, this is not true, right? Whereas you do see this difference. And we also find very large effect of having a female mayor, even in a period where you had very few deaths, right? So I think we're still capturing differences, even when you have only few deaths. And then you have also the containment policy result that suggests that in both periods you do have. But yeah, but I will dig more into like which dot is explaining this. Thank you. All right, so we do find that gender differences are driven by electorally motivated mayors, so those who are not term limited and who won with a small margin. And so the last test we do to speak to your question is to look at whether the effects are larger in places where you expect voters to be more biased. And so here, to measure voter bias, we use as a proxy gender discrimination on the labor market, which is the gender wage gap on the labor market. We also look at the gender gap in labor force participation, so how much women are working in the municipality, and we have similar results. So here again, the first two columns of the full sample. Here, we're looking at municipalities above the median, so where the gender wage gap is high, and municipalities below the median, where the gender wage gap is low. Again, we're cutting and we have small samples, but we do find that the impacts are larger in places above the median. This time it's significant for period 4, but not for period 1 in terms of differentiating column 3 and 5 or 4 and 6. But we do find that in magnitude and significant, the impacts are larger in places where you have a higher gender wage gap. Another measure of gender discrimination we use is the share of past female councillors. So basically, councillors are elected at the same time and by the same voters as mayors, but we have many more female councillors than we have female mayors. And so we look in the last 2 elections, the share of female councillors that the municipality elected. And so in places where they elected only a few female councillors, you can expect voter discrimination to be higher than in places where they were likely to elect a large share of female councillors. And so this is what we find, the effects are larger below the median, so in places that elected fewer female officials before. So this time, this is the reverse. We have a significant difference in column 1, but not 4. So the gender differences are larger for municipalities below the median. So this is supporting evidence that the gender differences are larger in places where you expect voters to be more biased. So this is not, again, direct evidence of voter bias, but this is all consistent with electoral incentives and voter bias explaining the gender differences we find. And it suggests really that female mayors are responding to the way voters view them rather than to their intrinsic preferences. So in the paper, we discussed alternative mechanisms. We already discussed them. So pure preference over health or the economy, being more cautious and learning over time, or risk aversion, and being more adverse to losing the election. But basically, they failed to explain all the results we have. So to conclude, we do provide evidence that electoral incentive and gender biases play a key role in explaining why Brazilian female mayors handled the COVID-19 crisis differently. And so hopefully I conveyed that beyond politics and beyond COVID, this has implications for the way we interpret gender differences. So first, in politics, it means that gender differences in leaders' behavior are particularly likely to materialize in competitive elections, while electoral incentives are high, for salient policies on which you expect voters to judge you, and when policy effectiveness is uncertain, so that there is room for this bias in effectiveness. Beyond politics, it also suggests that the presence of gender stereotypes and norms can create incentive for women to behave differently. And so this calls for educational and institutional policies to address those biases in order to build societies with more equal opportunities. So thank you so much for your questions and happy to meet with. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. Questions that comments regarding the geographical spillover effect. Because I'm thinking maybe for mayors are more likely to check out policies like closing a center business when they observe someone close to them to do that rather than someone further away do that. But on the other hand, I remember the show of thoughts, something that actually the male being elected is quite scattered across the region, right? So I thought if that's true, then that will very well address that concern. If I remember the map.
Yes, so you're right. I mean, more generally, right? Any geographical differences, like whether you're closer to like Sao Paulo or whether you're more in urban places, and as you said, like if you observe what your neighbor is doing. So in our case, we show the map. We show also balance on the distance to Sao Paulo, on like the distance to airports and other geographical stuff. So they're balanced. Now it could be an interesting heterogeneity results and also to look at whether, you know, female or male mayors are more or less likely to respond to their neighbors' choices. I mean, perhaps it's even another paper. You know, maybe voters are expecting, like, would punish more women for not following what the others are doing, whereas they would say, oh, men are so independent, it's great. I mean, I have plenty of biases I could think about. So that could be an interesting thing to study, yeah.
Echo what Louis said. This is just so interesting, and I think the results are really good.
Thank you.
I feel like qualitative evidence would be so good.
Yeah.
Like even just some polling. Was there any polling done of the mayors during this period? Like some case studies, maybe like of two different, you know, just to really bring it to life that like these are what voters are, you know, some more evidence of the voters.
So we haven't found a low-hanging fruit in doing this. So I guess so we thought about different stuff, right? So looking at like social media, but we need to go back in time, which is not easy because of course we started after to get all the data. So like social media, you know, how people reacted to posts by a man versus a women mayor. We like newspaper, but at the local level, it would be challenging to get. I mean, there is not like there is no like survey evidence in Brazil at such a local level. Again, it's 5,000 municipalities, so it's really. Then we also thought about running our survey. That would not be about COVID, but more generally about how you assess your leader based on their gender, right? We could like run like field surveys in Brazil. So that's something. The other thing we're thinking about to get more like some evidence about being punished more is to use actually rainfall data to have variation on the number of deaths just before the election and see whether it affects re-election differently for men and women. So it's something that is not directly related to what they do. So you would need misattribution and voter bias, right? So you would need voters to think this is due to their mayor.
Could you look at just whether they win the next election as an outcome?
Yes, so we do have this outcome. I'm pointing to the slide because I mentioned it in the last slide, but we do find that they have the same re-election probability, which I think is also telling, because if you think that they're always closer to voters' preferences, they should have a higher probability of winning absent discrimination. So what they're doing is optimizing to get the same re-election probability as men. So we find this. In previous years in Brazil, they had lower probability of winning, like in 2016. I think here it's in some sense useful because they have only one policy they can focus on. So we know what voters are going to assess them on, and they can really strategize this policy. That would be my interpretation of why they can optimize. Yeah. But so yeah, we wanted to have an idea of whether when you experience more death, even if it's random, you're more likely to be punished in the booth for women by using it.
You should interview some of the mayors. Just get an RA to put together like a list
Yeah.
of all their emails. Like it's 900 emails, you know, less. Maybe you'll find like half of them have an email address of their office. It's worth it. Just say I'm a professor at UCLA. Can I talk to you? And then it's like less risky for them because it's in the past.
And even the one re-elected, they're term limited now, so.
Yeah, so. Just ask.
Yeah,
Let's take this. Designing policy, be interesting to see.
yeah, that's true. No, that's a good idea, yeah.
I think kind of the discussion of the way, right, whether it's like learning or earlier,
Yeah.
there's this sort of risk aversion. I think this figure that you had with the like 8 plots or whatever it was by month, right,
Mhm.
of the 2 lines. I think if you just look at that figure, I think you could really think it's either learning or they are risk averse, because the women are basically late with everything, right? They are later in terms of closing it down, and then they are later in terms of opening it
Yeah.
up again.
I like Darren's women are smarter, except.
Or more cautious, let's say more cautious. No, yeah,
The time. So then I guess to go against that, you would say, but we only see it in close elections, or when when they can be re-elected, right? When
Yeah.
they are so for the races, I guess where they can't be re-elected, all those lines are kind of just flat across the.
yeah, so it's much harder for policies to look at this because we have half of the sample for policy, so we cannot really cut for policy. That's why we look at death. But yes, for death, yeah. That's what I mean, but we also see death as like a more like reliable outcome in the sense that it captures everything mayors would do. I mean, what we observe in terms of policies is only what we can observe, but you could have other things that they were doing or saying, or so it's basically like this would be a summary measure of all what they did to contain the pandemic, right? And then we corroborate that it's indeed correlated to some stuff we can observe. So that's how it.
Yeah.
About some sort of survey experiment.
Yeah.
Um,
So we thought hard about it, like, because we think it will delay a lot the submission if we like start doing experiment and stuff. So we thought, okay, maybe it's not material for rejection, and let's do that if we have the comment by a referee.
Well, I was thinking like. Set of journals to consider, I mean, with the survey experiment. I just don't know whether
Yeah.
like one big, but slower versus,
Yeah, I think yeah, our preference was just to like, it's also COVID, I mean, like.
yeah, no, for sure, for sure.
I mean, of course, we're not framing it as a COVID paper, but so we're a bit afraid of waiting too long on this, yeah.
Yeah.
But we'll see if we, if we're rejected and we feel that the main thing is the lack of like more direct evidence of viral bias or like anecdotal evidence and stuff, though.
It was very cool. I hope you aim high with it.
Yeah. I mean, I aim. I hope I reach.
I feel like sometimes it's crapshoot, like that.
Yeah.
But it was very cool.
Thank you. Thank you.